July 3rd. Lee rose by starlight, as he had done the previous morning, with equally fervent hopes of bringing this bloodiest of all his battles to a victorious conclusion before sunset. 2 months ago today, Chancellorsville had thundered to its climax, fulfilling just such hopes against longer odds, and 1 month ago today, hard on the heels of a top-to-bottom reorganization occasioned by the death of Stonewall Jackson, the Army of Northern Virginia had begun its movement from the Rappahannock northward to where an even greater triumph had seemed to be within its reach throughout the past 40-odd hours of savage fighting. Today would settle the outcome, he believed, not only of the battle, that went without saying, flesh and blood, bone and sinew and nerve could only stand so much, but also, perhaps, of the war, which after all was why he'd come up here to Pennsylvania in the first place. He woke to a stillness so profound that one of Gibbon's officers rolled in his blankets near a small clump of trees on Cemetery Ridge, 2/3 of the way up the shank of the Union fishhook, heard the courthouse clock a mile away in Gettysburg strike 3. Lee emerged from his tent soon afterwards, fully dressed for the fight, and shared a frugal breakfast with his staff. 3 miles northwest, Pickett's men were stirring too, in a grove of oaks where they had made camp beside the Chambersburg Pike at sundown. Well rested, though still a little stiff from yesterday's long march, which had ended not in battle as they had expected, but in bivouac, they were the shock troops Lee would employ today in an ultimate attempt to achieve the breakthrough he'd been trying for all along. It was for this reason, this purpose, that he'd withheld them from the carnage they might otherwise have arrived in time to share the day before. With sunrise only an hour away, however, it was obvious that he had abandoned his plan for a dawn attack. A good 2 hours would be required for Pickett to move his 3 brigades from their present bivouac area and mass them in a jump-off position well down Seminary Ridge. For them to have any share in an attack at dawn, they had to have been in motion at least an hour ago, and Lee not only had not sent Pickett or his corps commander any word of his intentions, he did not even do so now. Perhaps, on second thought, he'd reasoned that more deliberate preparations were required for so desperate an effort, including another daylight look at the objective, which the enemy might have reinforced or otherwise rendered impregnable overnight. Besides, the assault would necessarily be a one-shot endeavor. Late was as good as early, and maybe better, since it not only would permit a more careful study of all the problems, but also would lessen the time allowed the Federals for mounting and launching a counterattack in event of a Confederate repulse. Or perhaps it was even simpler than that. Perhaps Lee merely wanted time for one more talk with the man he called his war horse, whose 3 divisions he had decided to use in the assault. At any rate, it was Longstreet he set out to find as soon as he mounted Traveler in the pre-dawn darkness and rode eastward up the reverse slope of Seminary Ridge, delaying only long enough to send a courier to Ewell with word that the proposed attack, though still designed as a simultaneous effort on the right and the far left, would be delayed until 10 o'clock or later. From the crest of the ridge, as he gazed southeast to where the first pale streaks of dawn had just begun to glimmer, he was greeted by a sudden eruption of noise that seemed to have its source in the masked valley beyond Cemetery Hill. It was gunfire, unmistakably, a cannonade mounting quickly to a sustained crescendo. But whose? In the absence of reports, Lee could not tell, but he knew at once that one of 2 regrettable things had happened. Either his message had failed to reach Ewell in time, in which case his plan for the synchronization of the 2 attacks had gone awry, or else Meade had gotten a jump on him in that direction, leaving Ewell no choice whatsoever in the matter of when to fight. In point of fact, it was something of both. The courier had not yet reached 2nd Corps headquarters. Indeed, he had not had time to, and Meade had seized the initiative. Slocum, returning to the Federal right with both of his divisions before midnight, had massed them along the Baltimore Pike for the purpose of driving the Confederates from the lower end of Culp's Hill, where they had effected a lodgment soon after his sundown departure. Half an hour before dawn, accordingly, he opened with 4 batteries he had posted along the northern slope of Powers Hill, blasting away at the rebels crouched in the trenches his own men had dug the day before. For 15 minutes he kept up the fire, taking care that the guns did not overshoot and drop their shells on Green's troops just beyond, then paused briefly to survey the damage as best he could in the dim light. Apparently unsatisfied, he resumed the cannonade, joined now by a battery firing southeast from Cemetery Hill, and continued it for the better part of an hour, after which he intended to launch an infantry assault. This time, though, it was the Confederates who got the jump on their opponents in their struggle for possession of the barb of the Union fishhook. Unable to bring artillery over Rock Creek and the rough ground he'd crossed to gain the position he now held, Johnson had his men lie low among the rocks and in the trenches while the shells burst all around them. Then, as soon as the hour-long bombardment ended, he sent them surging forward, determined to gain control of the Baltimore Pike in accordance with the last night's orders from Lee and Ewell. In this he was unsuccessful, though he gave it everything he had, including the added strength of the 2 brigades from Rhodes under Junius Daniel and Edward O'Neill. Slocum's troops refused to yield, and now that the Graybacks were out of their holes, the guns resumed their firing on the left and on the right, their targets clearly defined for them against the rising sun. Presently word arrived from Ewell that Lee had ordered a postponement of the attack here on the left so that it might be coordinated with Longstreet's on the right, which had been delayed. But old Clubby, fighting less by now in hope of gain than for survival, to attempt to disengage would be to invite destruction, no longer had any say-so in the matter. Unrelentingly severe, the contest degenerated into a series of brief advances and sudden repulses, first by one side, then the other. For better than 5 hours this continued, Slocum being reinforced by a brigade from Sedgwick's corps, and Johnson adding William Smith's brigade of Early's division to his ranks. But neither could gain a decided advantage over the other, except in the weight of metal thrown. The unopposed Federal guns made the real difference, and they were what told in the end. By 10:30, the Confederates had been driven off Culp's Hill, approximately back to the line at its eastern base along Rock Creek, from which they'd launched their attack the day before. Slocum, having recovered his lost trenches, was content to hold them, and Johnson was obliged to forego any attempt to retake them. All he could do today he'd done already, for the casualties in his 7 brigades had been heavy, and the survivors were fought to a frazzle. Whatever Longstreet was going to accomplish around on the far side of the fishhook would have to be accomplished on his own. Lee had already taken this into account, however, and he had not seen in it any cause for cancellation of his plans. Ewell's share in them had been secondary anyhow, a diversionary effort designed to mislead his opponent into withholding reinforcements from that portion of the Federal line assigned to Longstreet for a breakthrough, with consequent disruption of the whole. If Meade had taken the offensive against Ewell, Lee's purpose might be served even better in that regard, since this would require the Northern commander to employ more troops at the far end of his position than if he had remained on the defensive there. A more serious question was whether he could be prevented from turning the tables on the Confederates by scoring a breakthrough of his own. But Lee was no more inclined to worry about the possibility of such a mishap here at Gettysburg than Jackson had been at Fredericksburg, when he remarked of the soldiers now under fire on Culp's Hill, "My men have sometimes failed to take a position, but to defend one, never." Lee might have said the same thing now, and he also might have added on Ewell's behalf, as Jackson had done on his own, "I am glad the Yankees are coming." At any rate, after pausing on the crest of Seminary Ridge to listen to the cannonade 2 miles across the way, he turned traveler's head southward, noting with pleasure by the spreading light of dawn that Meade did not seem to have strengthened his center overnight, and continued his ride in search of Longstreet. He found him shortly after sunrise, 3 miles down the line, in a field just west of Round Top. The burly Georgian had emerged at last from the gloom into which his heavy losses, following hard upon the rejection of his counsel, had plunged him the previous evening. Moreover, his first words showed the reason for this recovery of his spirits. "General," he greeted Lee, "I've had my scouts out all night, and I find that you still have an excellent opportunity to move around to the right of Meade's army and maneuver him into attacking us." Apparently he believed that yesterday's experience must have proved to the Southern commander the folly of attempting to storm a position of great natural strength, occupied by a numerically superior foe who had demonstrated forcefully his ability to maintain it against the most violent attempts at dislodgment. But Lee was as quick to set old Peter straight today as he had been the day before, and he did so with nearly the same words. "The enemy is there," he said, pointing northeast as he spoke, "and I am going to strike him." Longstreet's spirits took a sudden drop. He knew from Lee's tone and manner that his mind was quite made up, that no argument could persuade him not to continue the struggle on this same field. Accordingly, after giving instructions canceling the intended shift around the south end of the Federal line, old Peter turned again to his chief to receive his orders for the continuation of the battle he did not want to fight, at least not here. These orders only served to deepen his gloom still further. What Lee proposed was that Longstreet strike north of the Round Tops with his whole corps, now that Pickett was at hand, in an attempt to break the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. Essentially, this was what old Peter had tried and failed to do the day before after protesting to no avail, and he did not believe that his chances for success had been improved by the repulse already suffered, especially in view of the fact that all three of the attacking divisions had been fresh and up to full strength when they were committed yesterday, whereas two of the three Lee intended to employ today were near exhaustion and had lost no less than a third of their men by way of demonstrating that the attempt had been unwise in the first place. In opposing the selection of troops for the assault, Longstreet pointed out that to withdraw his two committed divisions from the vicinity of the Devil's Den and the wheat field would be to expose the right flank of the attacking column to assault by the Bluecoats now being held in check in that direction. Lee thought this over briefly, then agreed. McLaws and Law would hold their ground. Pickett would be supported instead by two of Hill's divisions, and the point of attack would be shifted northward, from the left center to the right center of the enemy ridge, though this would afford the attackers less cover and a greater distance to march before they came to grips with the defenders on the far side of the nearly mile-wide valley. Longstreet did some rapid calculations. Pickett had just under 5,000 men, his division being the smallest in the Army, and the chances were that Hill's would be no larger, if as large, after his losses of the past 2 days. That gave a rough total of 15,000 or less, and Longstreet did not believe this would be enough to do the job Lee had in mind. Perhaps he had reproached himself the night before for not having made a firmer protest yesterday against what he had believed to be an unwise assignment. If so, he made sure now, at the risk of being considered insubordinate, that he would have no occasion for self-reproach on that account tonight. "General," he told Lee in a last face-to-face endeavor to dissuade him from extending what he believed was an invitation to disaster, "I have been a soldier all my life. I've been with soldiers engaged in fights by couples, by squads, companies, regiments, divisions, and armies, and should know as well as anyone what soldiers can do. It is my opinion that no 15,000 men ever arrayed for battle can take that position." Lee's reply to this was an order for Pickett to be summoned. He was to post his 3 brigades behind Seminary Ridge, just south of the Army command post near the center of the line, and there await the signal to attack. 2 of Anderson's brigades, those of Lang and Wilcox, already posted in the woods adjoining Pickett's assembly area, would be on call for his support if needed. On his left, north of the command post, and also under cover of the ridge, Heath's 4 brigades, under Pettigrew, for Heath was still too jangled to resume command, would be massed for the same purpose, supported in turn by 2 brigades from Panda, who was also incapacitated. Longstreet was to be in overall command of the attack, despite his impassioned protest that it was bound to fail, and would give the signal that would launch it, though only 3 of the 11 brigades involved were from his corps. The plan itself, as Lee explained it to his lieutenant while they rode northward for an inspection of the terrain and the units selected to cross it, had at least the virtue of simplicity. The objective was clearly defined against the skyline, a little clump of umbrella-shaped trees, 4/5 of a mile away on Cemetery Ridge, just opposite the Confederate command post. Pickett and Pettigrew, each with 2 brigades in support, would align on each other as they emerged from cover and advanced, guiding on the distinctive landmark directly across the shallow valley from the point where their interior flanks would come together. By way of softening up the objective, the assault would be preceded by a brief but furious bombardment from more than 140 guns of various calibers. 80 from the 1st Corps, disposed along a mile-long arc extending from the Peach Orchard to the command post back on Seminary Ridge, and 63 from the 3rd Corps, strung out north of the command post along the east slope of the ridge. This would be the greatest concentration of artillery ever assembled for a single purpose on the continent, and Lee appeared to have no doubt that it would pave the way for the infantry by pulverizing or driving off the batteries posted in support of the Union center. Longstreet displayed considerably less confidence than did his chief as they rode north along the line McLaws had fallen back to in the darkness after charging eastward across the wheat field and partway up the western slope of Cemetery Ridge. "Never was I so depressed as upon that day," old Peter declared years later. Presently, they came to Wofford, who proudly reported to Lee that his brigade had nearly reached the crest of the ridge the day before, just north of Little Round Top, in pursuit of the troops Dan Sickles had exposed. But when the Army commander inquired if he could not go there again, the Georgian's jubilation left him. "No, General, I think not," he said. "Why not?" Lee asked. And Wofford replied, "Because, General, the enemy have had all night to entrench and reinforce. I had been pursuing a broken enemy, and the situation now is very different." Longstreet looked at Lee to see what effect this might have on him, but apparently it had none at all. The 2 men continued their ride northward, all the way to the sunken lane where Rhodes' 3 remaining brigades were posted on the outskirts of Gettysburg, and then back south again. Twice they rode the full length of the critical front, and all this time Lee refused to be distracted by the clatter of Ewell's desperate back-and-forth struggle across the way, smoke from which kept boiling out of the hidden valley in rear of Lee's prime objective on Cemetery Ridge. He was leaving as little as possible to chance, including the posting of individual batteries for the preliminary bombardment. Only once, in the 3 hours required for this careful examination of the ground over which the attack would pass, did he admit the possibility that it might not be successful. And this was when A.P. Hill, who joined him in Longstreet in the course of the reconnaissance, suggested that instead of using only 8 of his 13 brigades as instructed, he be allowed to send his whole corps forward. Lee would not agree. "What remains of your corps will be my only reserve," he said, "and it will be needed if General Longstreet's attack should fail." By now it was 9 o'clock. Pickett's 3 brigades of 15 veteran regiments, 4,600 men in all, and every one a Virginian from the division commander down, were filing into position behind Seminary Ridge, there to await the signal which Longstreet, who would give it, believed would summon them to slaughter. Pickett himself took no such view of the matter. He saw it rather as his first real chance for distinction in this war, and he welcomed it accordingly, his hunger in that regard being as great as that of any man on the field on either side. This was not only because he had missed the first 2 days of battle, marking time at Chambersburg, then eating road dust on the long march toward the rumble of guns beyond the horizon, but also because it had begun to appear to him less than 2 years short of 40 and therefore approaching what must have seemed the down slope of life, that he was in danger of missing the whole war. That came hard, for he had already had one taste of glory 16 years ago in Mexico, and he had found it sweet. After a worse than undistinguished record at West Point, the class of 1846 had had 59 members, including George McClellan and T.J. Jackson, and Pickett had ranked 59th. He went to war within a year of graduation and was the first American to scale the ramparts at Chapultepec, an exploit noted in official reports as well as in all the papers. 12 years later, he'd made news again, this time by defying a British squadron off San Juan Island in Puget Sound. "We'll make a Bunker Hill of it," he told his scant command, for which he was commended by his government and applauded by the press. Then came secession, and Pickett resigned his commission and headed home from Oregon. Arriving too late for 1st Manassas, he was wounded in the shoulder at Gaines Mill just too early for a part in the charge that carried the day. That was a year ago this week, and he'd seen no large-scale fighting since, not having returned to duty till after 2nd Manassas and Sharpsburg. At Fredericksburg, his division had been posted in reserve with scarcely a glimpse of the action and no share at all in the glory. After which, by way of capping the anticlimax as it were, the Suffolk excursion had caused him to miss Chancellorsville entirely. But now there was Gettysburg, although the contest was 2/3 over before he reached the field. And when he was offered this opportunity to deliver what Lee had designed as a climactic blow of the greatest battle of them all, he perceived at last what fate had kept in store for him through all these tantalizing months of blank denial. He grasped it eagerly, not only for his own sake, but also for the sake of the girl he called the charming Sally, his letters to whom were always signed, "Your Soldier." So eager was he, indeed, that an English observer who saw him for the first time here today, just after Pickett learned of his assignment, described him as a desperate-looking character. But the fact was, he might have given that impression almost anywhere, on or off the field of battle, if only because of his clothes and his coiffure. Jaunty on a sleek black horse, he wore a small blue cap, buff gauntlets, and matching blue cuffs on the sleeves of his well-tailored uniform. Mounted or afoot, he carried an elegant riding crop. His boots were brightly polished, and his gold spurs glinted sunlight, rivaling the sparkle of the double row of fire-gilt buttons on his breast. Of middle height, slender, graceful of carriage, dapper and alert, a more familiar witness termed him, while another spoke of his marvelous pulchritude. He sported a curly chin beard and a mustache that drooped beyond the corners of his mouth and then turned upward at the ends. To add to the swashbuckling effect, his dark brown hair hung shoulder length in ringlets which he anointed with perfume. There were those who alleged that he owed his rapid advancement to his friendship with the Corps commander, which dated back to the peacetime army, rather than to any native ability, which in fact he'd had little chance to prove. Taking Longstreet's orders in emergencies, the Corps adjutant will recall, I could always see how he looked after Pickett and made us give him things very fully. Indeed, sometimes stay with me to make sure he didn't go astray. His 3 brigadiers were all his seniors in years, and one had been his senior in rank as well until Pickett's October promotion to Major General. James L. Kemper, the youngest, was just past his 40th birthday. A former Piedmont lawyer and politician, twice elected Speaker of the House of Delegates, he was the only non-professional soldier of the lot, and though he retained a fondness for high-flown oratory, judging by manner and conversation alone, an associate observed, he had been classed as a bombastes furioso, his combat record was a good one, as was that of his troops, whose 3 previous commanders now commanded the 3 corps of the Army. Kemper had been with the brigade from the outset, first at the head of a regiment, and had fought in all of its battles, from 1st Manassas on. He and his men shared another proud distinction, dating back to what Southerners like to refer to as the earlier Revolution. One of the 5 regiments was a descendant of George Washington's first command, and Kemper's grandfather had served as a colonel on the future president's staff. By contrast, though he too was of a distinguished Old Dominion family, one that had given the Confederacy the first of its 77 general officers who would die of wounds received in action, Richard B. Garnett was a comparative newcomer to the division and had never led his present brigade in a large-scale battle. 45 years old, strikingly handsome, a West Pointer and a regular Army man, He had advanced rapidly in the early months of the war and had succeeded Jackson as commander of the Stonewall Brigade. Then at Kernstown, where he ordered a withdrawal to avoid annihilation, had come tragedy. Jackson removed him from his post and put him in arrest for retreating without permission. Garnett promptly demanded a court-martial, convinced that it would clear him of the charge. But the case dragged on for months, interrupted by battle after battle, all of which he missed, until Lee took a hand in the matter immediately after Sharpsburg and transferred him to Longstreet's corps to take command of Pickett's brigade when that general, whom he'd previously outranked, was promoted to command of the division. Neither Fredericksburg nor Suffolk brought Garnett the opportunity by which he hoped to clear his record of the Kernstown stain. And now in Pennsylvania, he was not only limping painfully from an injury lately suffered when he was kicked in the knee by a horse, he was also sick with chills and fever. Medically speaking, he should have been in bed, not in the field, but he was determined to refute, with blood if need be, the accusations Jackson had leveled against his reputation. The third and oldest of the three brigadiers, 46-year-old Lewis Armistead, was also something of a romantic figure, though less by circumstance than by inclination. A widower, twice breveted for gallantry in Mexico, he was a great admirer of the ladies and enjoyed posing as a swain. This had earned him the nickname Lo, an abbreviation of Lothario, which was scarcely in keeping with his close-cropped, grizzled beard or receding hairline. He had, however, a sentimental turn of mind and fond memories of life in the old army. For example, he and Hancock, who was waiting for him now across the way, though neither knew it, had been friends. Hancock, goodbye, he had said in parting 2 years ago on the West Coast as he prepared to cross the continent with Albert Sidney Johnston. You can never know what this has cost me. As he spoke, he put both hands on his friend's shoulders, and tears stood in his eyes. Now he and Dick Garnett stood together on the crest of Seminary Ridge, looking out across the gently rolling valley toward the little clump of umbrella-shaped trees which had been pointed out to them as their objective, just under a mile away on Cemetery Ridge. Both men were experienced soldiers, and both knew at a glance the ordeal they and their brigades would be exposed to when the signal came for them to advance. Finally, Garnett broke the silence. "This is a desperate thing to attempt," he said. Armistead agreed. "It is," he replied, "but the issue is with the Almighty, and we must leave it in His hands." Completing what was described as a shady, quiet march of about 5 miles, southeast along the turnpike, then due south through the woods along the far bank of a stream called Pitz's Run, Pickett's men were unaware of what awaited them beyond the screening ridge. Or, as one among the marchers later put it, no gloomy forebodings hovered over our ranks. Not since Sharpsburg, nearly 10 months ago, had the troops in these 15 regiments been involved in heavy fighting, and this encouraged them to believe, quite erroneously, but after the custom of young men everywhere, that they were going to live forever. Near the confluence of Pitz's and Willoughby runs, they were halted and permitted to break formation for a rest in the shade of the trees. The sun had burned the early morning clouds away, and though the lack of breeze gave promise of a sultry afternoon, the impression here in this unscarred valley behind Seminary Ridge was of an ideal summer day, no different from any other except in its perfection. Never was sky or earth more serene, more harmonious, more aglow with light and life, one among the loungers afterwards wrote. Presently they were called back into ranks, told to leave their extra gear in the care of a single guard from each regiment, and marched eastward over the crest of the ridge, then down its opposite slope and into a wooded swale a couple of 100 yards beyond where they were halted. Here, too, they were shielded from hostile observers by the low bulge of earth extending northward from the peach orchard, along which they could see the corps artillery disposed in a slow curve from the right, the cannoneers silhouetted against the skyline directly in their front. 2 brigades of infantry were up there, too, under Wilcox, but Pickett's orders were for his own troops to take it easy here in the swale, doing nothing that might attract the enemy's attention. Soon after they were in position, Lee arrived and began to ride along the lines of reclining men. Mindful of their instructions not to give away their presence, they refrained from cheering. But as the general drew abreast of each company, riding slowly, gravely past, the men rose and took off their hats in silent salute. Lee returned it in the same manner, the sunlight in his gray hair making a glory about his head. If he seemed graver than usual this morning, he had cause. He had just come from making a similar inspection of the troops disposed northward along the densely wooded eastern slope of Seminary Ridge, where they too were waiting under cover for the signal to move out, and he had noticed that a good number of them wore bandages about their heads and limbs. Many of these poor boys should go to the rear. They are not able for duty, he remarked. Drawing rein before one hard-hit unit, he looked more closely and realized, apparently for the first time, how few of its officers had survived the earlier fighting. "I miss in this brigade the faces of many dear friends," he said quietly. Riding away, he looked back once and muttered to himself as if to fend off such tactical doubts as were provoked by personal sorrow. The attack must succeed. His choice of the half-dozen brigades had made up the left wing of the assault force. Heath's 4 plus 2 from Pender was doubly logical in that all the troops so chosen were handy to the jump-off position and had not been engaged the day before, which not only lessened the chance of disclosing his intention to the enemy by their preliminary movements, but also was presumed to mean that they were fresh, or at any rate well-rested, for the long advance across the valley and the subsequent task of driving the bluecoats off the ridge on the far side. What had not been taken into account, however, at least not until Lee saw for himself the thinned ranks and the bandaged wounds of the survivors, was the additional and highly pertinent fact that 5 of the 6 had suffered cruelly in the first day's fighting. Both division commanders were out of action, and only 2 of the 6 brigades were still under the leaders who had brought them onto the field. The one exception on both counts was Lane's brigade, which had not been heavily engaged and still had its original commander. But this was offset by the misfortune of the other brigade from Pender's division, which had lost its leader, Alfred Scales, together with all but 2 of its officers above the rank of captain and more than half of those of that rank or below. This was the unit Lee had paused in front of this morning to remark that he missed the faces of many dear friends, and it was led now by William Lawrence, who never before had commanded anything larger than a regiment. Moreover, because Lee did not consider Lane experienced enough to succeed the wounded Pender, he had summoned old Isaac Trimble over from Ewell and put him in charge of the 2 brigades, though he too had never served in such a capacity before, despite his recent promotion to Major General, and had had no previous acquaintance, on or off the field of battle, with the troops he was about to lead across the valley in support of the 4 brigades under Pettigrew. These last made up the first wave of the attack here on the left, and they too had been more severely mauled in the earlier fighting than the Army commander or his staff took into account. They were terribly mistaken about Heath's division in the planning, Lee's chief aide declared afterwards. It had not recovered, having suffered more than was reported on the first day. In point of fact, whether the planners knew it or not, the division had lost no less than 40% of its officers and men. Ordinarily, this would have ruled out its employment as a fighting force, particularly on the offensive, until it had been reorganized and brought back up to strength. But in this case, it had been selected to play a major role in the delivery of an attack designed as the climax of the Army's bloodiest battle. Whether the choice proceeded from ignorance, indifference, or desperation, there was evidence of all 3. Longstreet, while admitting his own profound depression, later said flatly that Lee had been excited and off his balance. Some measure of the condition of the division should have been perceived from the fact that only one of the original 4 commanders remained at the head of his brigade, and this was the inexperienced Davis, whose troops had lost so heavily when he led them into an ambush on the opening day. The captured Archer had been replaced by B.D. Fry, Colonel John M. Brockenbrough by Joseph Mayo, and Pettigrew by J.K. Marshall. All 3 colonels were thus as new to command of their brigades as Pettigrew was to command of the division, which in turn had not been organized till after Chancellorsville and had gone into its first fight as a unit less than 50 hours ago. It had in all, after the cooks, the extra duty men, and the lightly wounded were given rifles and brought forward into its ranks, about the same number of troops as Pickett had, that is, about 4,600. Trimble had 1,750 in the second line. If Wilcox and Lang added their 1,400 to the assault, this Pickett, Pettigrew, Trimble total of just under 11,000 would be increased to roughly 12,500 effectives, a figure well below the 15,000 which the man in overall command of the attack had already said would not be enough to afford him even the possibility of success. In addition to Armistead and Garnett, who agreed that the maneuver was a desperate thing to attempt, a good many other high-ranking officers had had a look at the ground in front by now, and their impressions were much the same. To a staff major on a mid-morning visit to the command post near the center, the long approach to the Union position across the shallow valley, more than half a mile out to the Emmitsburg Road, past a blue skirmish line almost as heavy as a single line of battle, then another quarter-mile up the gradual slope of Cemetery Ridge, where the main enemy line was supported from the crest above by guns that could take the attackers under fire throughout most of their advance, resembled a passage to the Valley of Death. Impressions mainly agreed, but reactions varied. For example, an artillerist observed that Pickett was entirely sanguine of success in the charge and was only congratulating himself on the opportunity, whereas Pettigrew seemed more determined than elated. Tomorrow would be his 35th birthday, and though his intellectual accomplishments were perhaps the highest of any man on the field, a scholar in Greek and Hebrew, fluent as well in most of the modern languages of Europe, he'd made the best grades ever recorded at the University of North Carolina, where he'd also excelled in fencing, boxing, and the single stick. Then had traveled on the continent and written a book on what he had seen before returning to settle down to a brilliant legal career, only to have it interrupted by the war and the experience of being left for dead on the field of Seven Pines. He now was devoting his abilities to the fulfillment of his military duties. Slender and lithe of figure, with a neatly barbered beard, a spiked mustache, and a dark complexion denoting his Gallic ancestry, Pettigrew was quite as eager as Pickett for distinction. But his eagerness was tempered by a sounder appreciation of the difficulties, since he had fought on this same field 2 days ago against this newest version of the Army of the Potomac. Perhaps he recalled today what he had written after a visit to Solferino. The invention of the Many-Ball and the rifle cannon would, it was thought, abolish cavalry and reduce infantry charges within a small compass. On the other hand, if he was remembering his comments on that battle fought 4 years ago in Italy, he might have drawn encouragement from the fact that in it the French had crushed the Austrian center, much as Lee intended to crush the Union center here today, with a frontal assault delivered hard on the heels of an intense bombardment. The men themselves, though few of them had the chance to examine the terrain over which they'd be advancing, knew only too well what lay before them. Lee and Longstreet had directed that they be told, and they had been in considerable detail. No disguises were used, one wrote afterwards, nor was there any underrating of the difficult work at hand. They were told of the opportunities as well as of the dangers, and it was stressed that the breaking of the Federal line might mean the end of the war. However, there were conflicting reports of their reaction. One declared that the men of Garnett's brigade were in splendid spirits and confident of sweeping everything before them, while another recalled that when Mayo's troops, who were also Virginians, were informed of their share in the coming attack, from being unusually merry and hilarious, they on a sudden had become as still and thoughtful as Quakers at a love feast. Some managed to steal a look at the ground ahead, and like their officers, they were sobered by what they saw. One such, a Tennessee sergeant from Fry's brigade, walked forward to the edge of the woods, looked out across the wide, open valley at the bluecoats standing toy-like in the distance on their ridge, and was so startled by the realization of what was about to be required of him that he spoke aloud, asking himself the question, "June Kimball, are you going to do your duty?" The answer, too, was audible. "I'll do it, so help me God," he told himself. He felt better then. The dread passed from him, he said later. When he returned to his company, friends asked him how it looked out there, and Kimball replied, "Boys, if we have to go, it will be hot for us, and we will have to do our best." All this time, the waiting soldiers had been hearing the clatter of Ewell's fight beyond the ridge. By 10:30, it had diminished to a sputter and withdrawn eastward, indicating only too plainly how he'd fared. Lee knew unmistakably, before any such admission reached him from the left, that what he had designed as a two-pronged effort had been reduced by Ewell's failure to a single thrust which the enemy would be able to oppose with a similar concentration of attention and reserves. However, he did not cancel or revise his plans in mid-career. That was not his way. Like Winfield Scott, on whose staff he'd served in Mexico, he believed that it would do more harm than good, once the selected units were in position, for him to attempt to interfere. "It would be a bad thing if I could not rely on my brigade and division commanders," he told a Prussian observer 3 days later. "I plan and work with all my might to bring the troops to the right place at the right time. With that, I have done my duty." The same rule applied to a brisk skirmish that broke out at 11 o'clock around a house and barn on the floor of the valley, half a mile east-northeast of the command post and about midway between the lines. Confederate sharpshooters posted in the loft of the barn had been dropping Federal officers on the opposing ridge all morning, and finally 2 blue regiments moved out and drove the snipers back, whereupon Hill's guns opened thunderously with a half-hour bombardment. This, in turn, made the house and barn untenable for the new occupants, who set them afire and withdrew to their own lines, having solved the problem they'd been sent to deal with. Lee watched from the command post and made no protest, either at the expenditure of ammunition, which was considerable, or at the resultant disclosure of the battery positions, which up to now the crews had been so careful to conceal. "I strive to make my plans as good as human skill allows," he told the Prussian inquirer, in further explanation of the hands-off policy he practiced here today. "But on the day of battle, I'll lay the fate of my army in the hands of God." By now it was noon, and a great stillness came down over the field and over the 2 armies on their ridges. Between them, the burning house and barn loosed a long plume of smoke that stood upright in the hot and windless air. From time to time, some itchy-fingered picket would fire a shot, distinct as a single hand-clap, but for the most part, the silence was profound. For the 11,000 Confederates maintaining their mile-wide formation along the wooded slope and in the swale, the heat was oppressive. They sweated and waited, knowing that they were about to be launched on a desperate undertaking from which many of them would not be coming back, and since it had to be, they were of one accord in wanting to get it over with as soon as possible. It is said that to the condemned in going to execution, the moments fly, a member of Pickett's staff wrote some years later, recalling the strain of the long wait. To the good soldier about to go into action, I am sure the moments linger. Let us not dare say that with him, either individually or collectively, it is that mythical love of fighting, poetical but fabulous, but rather that it is nervous anxiety to solve the great issue as speedily as possible without stopping to count the cost. The Macbeth principle, 'twere well it were done quickly, holds quite as good in heroic action as in crime.